What happened next would destroy a $20 million empire, expose a web of abuse hidden behind designer gowns and charity galas, and force one woman to choose between protecting her sister's secrets and saving her life. This isn't just another scandal story. This is about the moment when a camera becomes a weapon for justice instead of destruction. You're about to hear how one photograph changed everything, not just for the Sterling family, but for thousands of women who thought domestic violence only happened to other people. Because sometimes the most powerful pictures aren't the ones that destroy lives, but the ones that save them. Stay with me for the next 90 minutes, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about abuse, family loyalty, and the price of speaking truth to power. The camera flash went off just as his hand connected with her face. Melody Hartwell lowered her camera, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the small digital display. The image was crystal clear. Jonathan Sterling, Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Industries, mid-swing. Victoria Sterling, 8 months pregnant and radiant in emerald silk, recoiling from the blow. The ballroom chandelier casting dramatic shadows across their faces. But that moment was still 20 minutes away. For now, Melody adjusted her camera settings in the opulent grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, watching her older sister pose for what should have been the happiest photographs of her life. Sterling Industries was celebrating its 20th anniversary, and Victoria played her part perfectly. The devoted wife, the glowing mother-to-be, the elegant first lady of Chicago's business elite. "Smile bigger, darling," Jonathan commanded from across the room, his voice carrying that particular tone Melody had learned to recognize, the tone that made Victoria's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly. Victoria's smile widened on cue, but Melody caught something else through her lens, a flicker of pain that had nothing to do with pregnancy discomfort. The way Victoria's free hand moved protectively to her rounded belly when Jonathan wasn't looking. The subtle flinch when he approached. Melody had spent 3 years photographing celebrities in Los Angeles. She knew how to read faces, how to spot the cracks in carefully constructed facades. Victoria's marriage looked perfect from the outside, but Melody's trained eye saw the truth hiding beneath layers of designer makeup and practiced smiles. "The lighting is exquisite tonight," Caroline Mitchell said, appearing beside Melody with her own camera equipment. Caroline was the official event photographer, hired by Sterling Industries for their corporate materials. Melody was here as family, capturing personal moments for Victoria's album. "Your sister looks absolutely glowing." "She does," Melody agreed, but her focus remained on Jonathan. The way he positioned himself in every shot, how he guided Victoria's poses with firm grips that left brief indentations on her pale arms. The possessive hand that never left her waist, even when she clearly needed space to breathe. The ballroom buzzed with conversation as Chicago's business elite mingled over champagne and canapered hors d'oeuvres. Men in $1,000 suits discussed quarterly reports, while their wives compared vacation plans to Martha's Vineyard. Everyone wanted to be seen congratulating Jonathan Sterling on his company's success. 20 years ago, Jonathan had taken over Sterling Industries from his father Thomas, transforming it from a regional manufacturing company into a national powerhouse. Tonight's celebration honored that achievement, but Melody noticed how every conversation seemed to center around Jonathan's brilliance, his vision, his leadership. Victoria was merely an accessory, beautiful and pregnant and perfectly silent unless spoken to. "Family photos next," Jonathan announced, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. He gestured for Victoria to join him near the grand staircase, where Caroline had arranged professional lighting for formal portraits. Melody watched Victoria navigate the crowd, accepting congratulations on her pregnancy with gracious nods and practiced responses. 8 months along, she moved with careful precision, one hand always supporting her lower back. But when elderly Mrs. Henderson from the hospital charity board asked about nursery preparations, Melody saw Victoria's composure slip for just a moment. "Jonathan has very specific ideas about the baby's room," Victoria said quietly. "Everything must be perfect for the Sterling heir." There was something hollow in her voice, something that made Melody's photographer instincts prickle with unease. "Melody, come take some family shots," Victoria called, gesturing her sister over. "I want pictures from your perspective too." As Melody approached, she overheard the tail end of a conversation between Jonathan and Marcus Webb, his business partner. Their voices were low, but acoustics in the ballroom carried sound in unexpected ways. The Henderson account is secure, Marcus asked. Victoria handled it perfectly, Jonathan replied. Amazing what people will agree to when your pregnant wife makes the pitch. Motherhood makes women so much more trustworthy. Don't you think? The casual way he discussed Victoria as a business tool made Melody's stomach turn. She raised her camera, capturing what should have been a joyful moment between expectant parents. But all she saw through her viewfinder was Jonathan's controlling hand placement and Victoria's increasingly strained smile. Let's try one with just the ladies, Melody suggested, hoping to give Victoria a moment of respite. But Jonathan stepped closer instead. Family means all of us, doesn't it? His smile never wavered, but his grip on Victoria's waist tightened noticeably. We wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong idea about our happiness. That's when Melody heard it, the conversation that would haunt her for the rest of the evening. Jonathan leaned close to Victoria's ear, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow still audible in the brief lull between songs from the string quartet. You embarrass me in front of these people, and you'll regret it. We've discussed what happens when you don't play your part properly. Victoria's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. Her hand moved instinctively to cover a spot on her upper arm, hidden beneath the elegant sleeves of her maternity gown. Melody's finger hesitated over the camera's shutter button. She should take the picture, capture this moment of apparent domestic bliss for Victoria's photo album. But something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of the scene before her. Her sister wasn't glowing with happiness. She was terrified. The realization hit Melody like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her camera feel impossibly heavy in her hands. All those perfect family photos she'd been taking tonight told a story, but not the one anyone expected to see. They told the story of a woman trapped in a golden cage, performing happiness while her husband held the key. The ladies' room mirror reflected harsh fluorescent lighting that revealed what ballroom chandeliers had hidden. Victoria's makeup couldn't quite disguise the shadow beneath her left eye, or the way she favored her right side when she walked. Melody had followed Victoria here under the pretense of helping with a wardrobe adjustment, but really she needed to understand what she'd witnessed. The threatening whisper, the flinch, the protective way Victoria held herself. Your foundation is a little heavy tonight, Melody said carefully, setting down her camera and reaching for her sister's makeup bag. Want me to blend it better? Victoria's reflection met her eyes in the mirror. For just a moment, the perfect mask slipped. I fell down the stairs at home last week. Pregnancy makes me clumsy. But Melody had photographed enough domestic violence survivors in her Los Angeles days to recognize the careful phrasing, the quick explanation, the way Victoria's eyes darted toward the bathroom door as if checking for escape routes. Victoria, Melody said softly, you know you can tell me anything, right? Her sister's laugh sounded brittle, forced. Tell you what? That I'm living a fairy tale married to Chicago's most eligible bachelor, expecting our first child, living in a mansion on the Gold Coast. Victoria's hands shook slightly as she reapplied lipstick. What could possibly be wrong with that picture? Everything, Melody thought but didn't say. Instead, she gently touched Victoria's wrist, noting how her sister immediately pulled away from even casual contact. The bathroom door opened, making both women jump. Rebecca Matthews entered, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her expression sharp with the intelligence that made her one of Chicago's most feared divorce attorneys. There you are, Rebecca said to Victoria. But her eyes immediately cataloged the same details Melody had noticed. The careful makeup, the defensive posture, the way Victoria's hand moved protectively to her belly whenever she felt threatened. I was hoping we could chat before Jonathan's big speech. Victoria's expression shuddered completely. I should get back. He doesn't like it when I'm away too long. The phrasing made Rebecca's eyebrows rise almost imperceptibly. Melody caught the look and realized she wasn't the only one who'd noticed concerning patterns in Victoria's marriage. After Victoria left, Rebecca lingered, washing her hands with deliberate slowness. Your sister mentioned you used to work in Los Angeles. Photography was celebrity journalism, Melody admitted. The kind that ruins lives for page views and advertising revenue. And now I photograph weddings and baby showers in suburbs where the biggest scandal is whether the Petersons' pool boy is actually having an affair with Mrs. Peterson. Melody met Rebecca's knowing look in the mirror. I'm trying to do better work these days. Sometimes the most important pictures are the ones that help people instead of hurting them, Rebecca said quietly. Sometimes they're the difference between life and death. The words hung heavy in the artificially scented air of the ladies' room. Melody understood she was being given information, carefully and legally, by someone who couldn't directly violate client privilege, but desperately wanted to help. When Melody returned to the ballroom, she found herself seeing everything through different eyes, the way other guests instinctively gave Jonathan space, as if they sensed something dangerous beneath his polished exterior. How Victoria's friends approached her hesitantly, as though they'd learned that getting too close carried consequences. Her camera captured moments differently now. Instead of family joy, she documented evidence, the possessive grip, the intimidating postures, the way Victoria's smile never quite reached her eyes. Melody's mind drifted back 3 years to the scandal that had ended her paparazzi career. She'd photographed a young actress leaving a medical facility, assuming she was documenting another celebrity drug rehab story. The images went viral within hours, but the truth came out later. The woman had been seeking treatment for injuries sustained during domestic violence. Melody's photos had exposed her location to her abuser, leading to a confrontation that put the actress in intensive care. The guilt had consumed Melody for months. She'd built a career destroying lives for profit, convincing herself that celebrities were fair game, that their pain was public entertainment. But seeing that young woman's bruised face in hospital photos had shattered every justification she'd constructed. She'd quit the next day, moved home to Chicago, and started over with wedding photography and portraits of families who actually wanted their pictures taken. Victoria had been the only family member who'd welcomed her back without judgment, who'd believed Melody when she said she wanted to change. Now, 3 years later, Melody found herself in an impossible position. She had the skills to recognize what was happening to Victoria, the equipment to document it, and the context to expose it. But using those abilities would mean returning to the world she'd left behind, breaking the promise she'd made to herself about never again using her camera to hurt people she cared about. The string quartet transitioned into a waltz, and Jonathan took Victoria's hand for what the crowd would remember as a romantic dance between expectant parents. But Melody saw Victoria's barely concealed wince when he gripped her fingers too tightly. She saw the way Victoria maintained perfect posture despite obvious discomfort, performing happiness for an audience that wanted to believe in the fairy tale. Caroline appeared beside her again, reviewing images on her camera's display. "These are going to make beautiful promotional materials," she said. "The company's family values angle is so important to their brand image." Family values. Melody almost laughed at the bitter irony. Sterling Industries would use tonight's photos to sell an image of corporate responsibility and traditional American success. Jonathan would become the poster child for having it all: the thriving business, the devoted wife, the perfect family legacy growing in Victoria's womb. But Melody's camera told a different story. In every frame, she saw a woman performing her own imprisonment, dancing to music that played only for her captor's pleasure. The dance ended to enthusiastic applause. Jonathan kissed Victoria's forehead in a gesture the crowd found charming, but Melody noticed how Victoria's eyes closed, as if bracing herself for something worse. As the couple returned to their table, Melody made a decision that would change everything. She switched her camera to continuous shooting mode and adjusted her position to capture whatever came next, because her photographer's instincts, honed by years of predatory celebrity stalking, told her that the evening's true story was just beginning to unfold. Victoria Sterling stood in the marble bathroom of their Gold Coast mansion at 6:30 that morning, staring at her reflection while Jonathan showered in the adjoining master suite. The anniversary celebration was still hours away, but her stomach already churned with anxiety that had nothing to do with pregnancy. 8 months pregnant, she should have been glowing with anticipation for her son's arrival. Instead, she pressed concealer over fingerprint bruises on her upper arms, remnants from 2 nights ago when she'd questioned Jonathan's decision to fire their longtime housekeeper without consulting her. She was getting too familiar, he'd explained, his grip tightening when Victoria protested. "Making you think you could confide in her about private family matters. We can't have staff who forget their place." Maria had worked for them for 3 years, long enough to notice patterns in Victoria's injuries, long enough to ask gentle questions about her well-being, long enough to become a threat to the perfect image Jonathan worked so carefully to maintain. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message, and she grabbed it quickly, knowing Jonathan monitored her communications but hoping for a moment of connection with the outside world. The message was from Rebecca Matthews. "Still planning to make your announcement tonight? I have everything ready when you're prepared to move forward." Victoria's hands trembled as she deleted the message immediately. For 6 weeks, she'd been secretly meeting with Rebecca, preparing for the impossible: divorce papers, custody arrangements, financial settlements, an escape plan for after the baby was born. Jonathan controlled every aspect of their lives. Her credit cards were in his name, monitored and limited. Her car had a GPS tracking system he checked daily. Her phone had monitoring software that recorded her calls and messages, though she'd discovered a way to access a burner phone Rebecca had provided during their clandestine meetings. The bathroom door opened, and Jonathan emerged from the shower, toweling off his athletic frame. At 38, he maintained the physique and confidence that had attracted her 6 years ago when they'd met at a Chicago Business Council networking event. She'd been a rising marketing executive then, building her own career with fierce determination. Now she felt like a shadow of that woman. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, kissing her neck in what anyone observing would consider affectionate. But Victoria felt the possessive claim in the gesture, the reminder that she belonged to him completely. "Ready for our big night?" "Of course," she replied automatically, the response he expected. "I've been looking forward to celebrating your achievements." "Our achievements," he corrected, but his tone suggested the distinction was purely semantic. "Sterling Industries succeeds because we present a united front, the perfect American family building a legacy for our son." He placed his hand on her swollen belly, and Victoria forced herself not to recoil. Once his touch had thrilled her. Now it felt like ownership, a reminder of the life growing inside her that would forever connect them, no matter what legal documents Rebecca prepared. "I've arranged for extra security tonight," Jonathan continued, selecting a tie from his extensive collection. "There will be media present, and I want to ensure nothing disrupts our celebration." Victoria nodded, though something in his tone made her uneasy. Jonathan's definition of security often meant control, surveillance disguised as protection. Her phone buzzed again, and Jonathan's attention immediately sharpened. "Who's messaging you so early?" "Melody, asking about tonight's schedule," Victoria lied smoothly, deleting another text without reading it. She wants to make sure she captures all the important moments. Jonathan's expression darkened slightly at the mention of Victoria's younger sister. He'd never forgiven Melody for her paparazzi past, considering her a potential threat to their carefully curated image. But Victoria's insistence on having family at important events was one of the few battles she'd managed to win in their marriage. "Your sister better behave appropriately tonight," he said, his voice carrying the subtle menace Victoria had learned to recognize. "No inappropriate questions or photography. This is a corporate celebration, not a tabloid opportunity." "She understands," Victoria assured him, though privately she wondered if Melody truly grasped how dangerous Jonathan could be when his control was challenged. The morning routine continued with choreographed precision. Jonathan reviewed talking points for his evening speech, while Victoria prepared breakfast exactly how he preferred it. She answered his questions about the guest list, confirmed catering details, and listened to his instructions about how she should interact with various attendees. "The Henderson account is crucial," he reminded her, cutting his eggs with surgical precision. "Mrs. Henderson responded well to you at the hospital charity auction. Tonight, I need you to mention how much Sterling Industries values community partnerships. Work it into conversation naturally." Victoria nodded, adding another item to her mental list of performance requirements. Jonathan had discovered early in their marriage that her genuine warmth and intelligence made her an effective business asset. What had started as collaborative partnership had evolved into calculated exploitation, with Victoria deployed strategically to charm clients and investors while Jonathan closed deals. The irony wasn't lost on her that her marketing skills, once the foundation of her independent career, now served only to advance his empire. After breakfast, Jonathan left for the office to handle pre-event preparations, kissing Victoria goodbye with the same possessive intensity she'd grown to dread. Alone in their perfectly appointed home, she allowed her mask to slip for precious moments of privacy. Her reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman who looked nothing like the ambitious executive she'd once been. The designer maternity clothes couldn't disguise her defeated posture. The professional makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion that came from constant vigilance, from measuring every word and action against the potential for his displeasure. Victoria opened her laptop, checking her private email account that Rebecca had helped her establish. The draft divorce papers were there, waiting for her signature and the courage to move forward. Rebecca had been clear about the challenges they'd face. Jonathan's wealth and influence would make any legal battle complex and prolonged, but the attorney had also been clear about the stakes. Abuse escalates. Rebecca had warned during their last meeting in a coffee shop 40 minutes from Victoria's neighborhood, where they were unlikely to be seen by anyone from Jonathan's social circle. Pregnancy doesn't make it stop. Often, it makes it worse. You need to think about your safety and your child's future. Victoria's hand moved to her belly, feeling her son's restless movement. She'd already chosen his name David, after her late father, but she hadn't told Jonathan, knowing he'd insist on Jonathan Jr. or some variation that tied the child's identity to the Sterling legacy. Her son deserved better than growing up in a house where love was conditional on perfect obedience, where his mother's worth was measured only by her usefulness to his father's ambitions. Victoria had seen enough of Jonathan's interactions with his own father to understand the cycle she'd be perpetuating if she stayed. The security system chimed, indicating someone at the front gate. Victoria checked the monitor and saw Melody's car, arriving early to help with pre-event preparations. Her sister's presence was both a comfort and a concern. Melody's protective instincts were fierce, but her history with scandal photography made her a potential liability in Jonathan's eyes. As Victoria buzzed her sister through the gate, she made a silent decision. Tonight, at the anniversary celebration surrounded by Chicago's business elite, she would find a way to announce her independence. She would stop performing happiness and start claiming it for herself and her unborn child. She just had to survive until then. The Sterling Industries anniversary gala had reached that perfect moment when champagne loosened tongues and success stories flowed as freely as the top-shelf liquor. Jonathan Sterling stood at the podium, bathed in golden spotlight, commanding the attention of 400 of Chicago's most influential people. 20 years ago, he began, his voice carrying easily through the grand ballroom's acoustics. My father handed me not just a company, but a responsibility to honor the Sterling name, to build something lasting, to create a legacy worthy of the next generation. Victoria sat at the head table, her hands folded over her 8-month pregnant belly, watching her husband perform the role he'd perfected over 2 decades of public appearances. Charming, confident, completely in control. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of the decision she'd made that morning pressed against her chest like a physical force. The divorce papers were hidden in her purse, signed and ready to be delivered to Jonathan after their son was born. Rebecca had helped her establish a separate bank account, a safe house arrangement, even a protection order that could be activated with a single phone call. All Victoria had to do was continue playing her part for a few more hours. Success isn't built alone, Jonathan continued, his gaze finding Victoria in the crowd. It requires partnership, dedication, and the support of family who understand that excellence demands sacrifice. The words sounded romantic to the audience, but Victoria heard the underlying message. She was expected to sacrifice her autonomy, her career, her sense of self, all for the glory of Sterling Industries and the man who controlled it. Melody, positioned near the stage with her camera, caught Victoria's expression in that moment. Later, when everything went wrong, that photograph would show the exact instant when Victoria Sterling decided she was done sacrificing. My beautiful wife Victoria has been the heart of Sterling Industries' success, Jonathan said, extending his hand toward her. Her grace, her intelligence, and now the gift of carrying our son represent everything this company stands for. Family values, traditional excellence. The American dream built on unwavering commitment. The applause was thunderous, but Victoria heard it as if from underwater. She saw herself as Jonathan's audience saw her, the perfect corporate wife, beautiful and pregnant and completely devoted to her husband's vision. A prop in his success story. Something snapped inside her. Victoria rose from her chair with careful dignity, accepting the applause with a practiced smile. But instead of simply acknowledging the recognition and sitting back down, she stepped forward toward the microphone. Jonathan's expression flickered with surprise, then warning, This wasn't part of the planned script. "Thank you," Victoria said, her voice clear and strong. "It's wonderful to celebrate Sterling Industries' achievements with all of you tonight." The crowd settled into attentive silence, expecting gracious remarks about her husband's leadership and her gratitude for their shared life. Instead, Victoria continued with words that would shatter the evening's careful choreography. "Success in business, like success in marriage, requires certain foundational principles," she said, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "Honesty, mutual respect, trust, partnership based on equality rather than dominance." Jonathan's face began to change, the practiced smile slipping as he realized Victoria was deviating from acceptable boundaries. "When those principles are compromised," Victoria continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, "when success is built on control rather than collaboration, when one partner's dreams are sacrificed for the other's ambition, then we have to ask ourselves what we're really celebrating." The ballroom's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Conversations died as guests sensed the undercurrent of tension radiating from the head table. Jonathan stepped closer to Victoria, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "Darling, perhaps you should sit down. The baby." "The baby is fine," Victoria said firmly, pulling away from his reaching hand. "What's not fine is pretending that abuse becomes acceptable when it's wrapped in expensive suits and corporate success." The collective intake of breath from 400 people was audible. Jonathan's face transformed completely, the charming mask falling away to reveal something dark and dangerous underneath. "Victoria, you're clearly overwrought," he said, grabbing her arm with enough force that several guests noticed the aggressive gesture. "Pregnancy hormones can cause emotional instability. Let me help you." "Don't touch me like that," Victoria said loudly, jerking away from his grip. "Don't you ever put your hands on me like that again." The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan Sterling, Chicago's golden boy CEO, stood exposed in front of the city's power elite as a man who physically controlled his pregnant wife. His face contorted with rage that no amount of media training could disguise. "You ungrateful!" The slap echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Victoria staggered, her hand flying to her cheek as 400 people witnessed Jonathan Sterling strike his 8 months pregnant wife in front of Chicago's business establishment. At exactly that moment, positioned 30 feet away, with professional reflexes honed by years of celebrity photography, Melody's camera fired automatically. The high-end flash illuminated the scene with perfect clarity. Jonathan's face twisted with fury, his hand still raised from the blow. Victoria reeling backward, her other hand protectively cradling her belly. The shocked faces of the city's elite in the background. The photograph captured everything: the violence, the abuse of power, the destruction of carefully maintained facades. But more than that, it captured the moment when Victoria Sterling stopped being a victim and became a survivor. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Some guests rushed toward Victoria. Others stood frozen in shock. A few had the presence of mind to start recording with their phones, though Melody's professional equipment had captured far better evidence than any smartphone ever could. Jonathan realized immediately what had happened. His eyes found Melody's camera, saw the flash that had fired at the worst possible moment, understood that his carefully constructed empire had just crumbled in a fraction of a second. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice shaking as he attempted damage control, "my wife is clearly unwell. Pregnancy can cause episodes of confusion and paranoia. She needs medical attention. Not, 'I need medical attention because you hit me,'" Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom despite her shock. "In front of 400 witnesses, just like you've been hitting me for months." The words hung in the air like an indictment, transforming what might have been dismissed as a single moment of poor judgment into an acknowledgement of sustained domestic violence. Security personnel, hired by Jonathan to maintain order at the event, stood uncertainly at the room's perimeter. Their job was to protect Sterling Industries' interests, but nobody had prepared them for a scenario where the CEO himself was the threat. Rebecca Matthews pushed through the crowd, her legal training taking over as she assessed the situation with professional clarity. She immediately positioned herself between Jonathan and Victoria, creating a physical barrier while speaking in calm, authoritative tones. "Victoria needs medical evaluation," Rebecca announced to the crowd. "I'm calling an ambulance. Everyone please give her space. Jonathan started to protest, but Marcus Webb grabbed his arm, whispering urgently about corporate liability and media damage control. The business partners who had enabled Jonathan's behavior for years suddenly found themselves calculating the cost of continued association. Melody lowered her camera, her hands shaking as she reviewed the images she'd captured. 20 years of corporate celebration reduced to one perfect photograph of domestic violence, the evidence that could destroy Jonathan Sterling's empire and potentially save her sister's life. But as she looked at Victoria, bleeding slightly from her split lip while cradling her pregnant belly, Melody realized the hardest decisions were still ahead of them both. The photograph was just the beginning. The grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel had transformed from celebration venue to crime scene in the span of 90 seconds. 400 of Chicago's business elite stood in various states of shock, processing what they'd witnessed while smartphones appeared in dozens of hands, recording the aftermath of Jonathan Sterling's very public downfall. Melody's professional training took over as chaos erupted around her. She quickly reviewed the images on her camera's display, confirming what she already knew. The photographs were perfect, crystal clear, utterly damning. Jonathan's face twisted with rage, Victoria recoiling from the blow, the exact moment of impact captured with devastating precision. But as she studied the images, a familiar nausea crept through her stomach. These weren't just photographs. They were weapons. And Melody had spent 3 years learning how much damage the right image could inflict on a human life. "Dear God," Caroline Mitchell whispered, appearing at Melody's shoulder. The official event photographer looked pale, her own camera hanging unused around her neck. "Did you get that? Please tell me someone got evidence of what just happened." Melody nodded wordlessly, her throat tight with conflicting emotions. She had the evidence. The question was what to do with it. Near the head table, Victoria sat in a chair someone had brought for her, surrounded by a protective circle of women who'd immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Blood from her split lip had been cleaned away, but the red mark on her cheek would soon darken into an unmistakable bruise. Jonathan stood 20 feet away, his face cycling through damage control expressions while Marcus Webb whispered frantically in his ear. Other Sterling Industries executives formed a protective huddle, already calculating how to minimize corporate liability from their CEO's catastrophic public meltdown. "It was clearly an accident," Jonathan announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades of corporate leadership. "Victoria's 8 months pregnant. She's been having dizzy spells, episodes of confusion. When she started making incoherent statements, I reached out to steady her, but she pulled away suddenly and, 'You slapped me,' Victoria interrupted, her voice clear despite her shock. 'In front of everyone here, just like you've been doing for months when no one was watching.' The accusation landed like another physical blow. Several prominent Chicago socialites exchanged meaningful glances, suddenly recalling Victoria's frequent absences from social events, her carefully applied makeup that sometimes couldn't quite hide suspicious marks, her increasingly withdrawn behavior over the past year. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly charity board member who'd known Victoria since her engagement to Jonathan, stepped forward with the authority of Chicago's old money establishment. "Victoria, my dear," she said gently, "do you need medical attention? Should someone call the police?" Before Victoria could respond, Jonathan moved closer, his corporate smile failing to mask the threat in his approaching presence. But Grace Hartwell, arriving late to the celebration, pushed through the crowd with a mother's protective fury. "Get away from my daughter," Grace commanded, her retired teacher voice carrying absolute authority. At 58, she'd spent decades managing unruly teenagers and had no patience for grown men who bullied women. "Victoria, we're leaving. Now." "She's not going anywhere," Jonathan said, his mask slipping further as he lost control of the narrative. "This is a private family matter that's been blown out of proportion by pregnancy hormones and—" "This is domestic violence," Rebecca Matthews interrupted, her legal training evident in her calm, precise delivery. "Witnessed by 400 people and documented by multiple cameras. Mr. Sterling, I strongly advise you to step away from your wife and contact your attorney immediately." The mention of legal consequences seemed to penetrate Jonathan's rage. His eyes swept the ballroom, cataloging the smartphones recording his every word, The horrified expressions of business associates who just watched their golden boy reveal himself as an abuser. But his gaze fixed on Melody's professional camera with laser intensity. He understood immediately that her equipment would have captured far better evidence than any smartphone footage. Evidence that could destroy not just his marriage, but his entire empire. Jonathan began moving toward Melody with purposeful strides, his corporate charm completely abandoned. "You," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "Give me that camera. Now." Melody instinctively stepped backward, clutching her equipment protectively. Around her, the crowd sensed escalating danger and began creating space between themselves and the unraveling CEO. "The photographs you took are private family moments," Jonathan continued, his voice gaining volume and menace. "I won't allow them to be exploited for tabloid entertainment. Hand over the camera, or I'll have security take it from you." But the security personnel Jonathan had hired looked uncertain about their authority to confiscate media equipment from a credentialed photographer, especially one who just documented apparent criminal behavior by their employer. "Those aren't private family moments," Melody said, finding her voice despite her racing heart. "That's evidence of domestic violence, and I'm not giving you anything." Jonathan's face darkened with the same rage that had preceded his attack on Victoria. "You think you can destroy my family with your tabloid trash? I know exactly who you are. Melody Hartwell. I know what you did in Los Angeles. You're a vulture who profits from other people's pain?" The accusation hit like a physical blow because it contained enough truth to hurt. Melody had been that person. She had profited from scandal and suffering, justifying her actions with professional detachment and financial necessity. But this was different. This wasn't exploitation for profit. This was documentation of a crime, evidence that could protect her sister and potentially save her life. "Maybe I was that person once," Melody said, her voice gaining strength. "But I'm not using these photographs to hurt anyone. I'm using them to help my sister escape from you." The admission transformed the dynamic completely. This wasn't paparazzi opportunism. This was family protection. The distinction might not matter legally, but it mattered morally, and it mattered to the 400 witnesses evaluating the situation. Jonathan's next move revealed how completely he'd lost control. He lunged toward Melody, clearly intending to physically take her camera, but Grace Hartwell intercepted him with surprising agility for a 58-year-old retired teacher. "You will not touch my daughter," Grace said, positioning herself between Jonathan and Melody like a human shield. "You've done enough damage to this family." The sight of Chicago's prominent CEO being blocked by an elderly woman crystallized the evening's power dynamics for everyone present. Jonathan Sterling, revealed as an abuser, had lost the authority that came with reputation and wealth. Grace Hartwell, defending her daughters, commanded moral authority that trumped corporate position. Victoria used the distraction to stand, accepting support from Rebecca and Mrs. Henderson as she prepared to leave the scene of her public liberation. "Victoria, wait," Jonathan called desperately, his voice cracking with the realization that his carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. "We can work this out, privately, like civilized people. You don't understand what you're throwing away." Victoria turned back to face him, and for the first time all evening, her expression held no fear. "I understand perfectly," she said. "I'm throwing away a life where I'm terrified to breathe wrong, where our son would grow up thinking it's normal for fathers to hurt mothers. I'm throwing away everything that's been slowly killing me for the past 3 years." She paused, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "What I don't understand is how I waited so long to do it." The words carried across the silent ballroom with devastating finality. Victoria Sterling, 8 months pregnant and bleeding from her husband's blow, had just announced her independence in front of Chicago's most powerful people. As hotel security finally arrived to restore order, Melody realized she held more than photographs on her camera's memory card. She held the evidence of Victoria's transformation from victim to survivor, documented in perfect digital clarity. The question was whether she had the courage to use it. The ladies' room adjacent to the grand ballroom had become an impromptu war room where 3 generations of women wrestled with the most important decision of Victoria's life. Victoria sat in the velvet chair usually reserved for the powder room attendant, pressing an ice-filled cloth napkin to her swollen cheek while Grace paced like a caged tiger, and Melody stared at her camera's display screen. Show me the photographs, Victoria said quietly, extending her hand toward her sister. I need to see what you captured. Melody hesitated. The images were devastating, more damning than anything she'd photographed during her tabloid years. They showed not just the moment of violence, but the calculated fury behind it, the practiced way Jonathan had struck his pregnant wife, the shock of 400 witnesses who just watched Chicago's golden boy reveal his true nature. Victoria, Grace said, stopping her pacing to kneel beside her daughter's chair. Those pictures could change everything. They're evidence, proof of what he's been doing to you. They're also ammunition, Victoria replied, her voice hollow with exhaustion. Jonathan will use them to destroy Melody's reputation, claim she staged everything for tabloid profit. He'll spin this as a family vendetta, make himself the victim of paparazzi exploitation. Melody's stomach churned because Victoria wasn't wrong. Jonathan's first instinct had been to attack her credibility, to remind everyone of her Los Angeles scandal. He would absolutely weaponize her past against them both. But without evidence, Grace pressed gently, it becomes your word against his. A pregnant woman having hormonal episodes versus a respected businessman having a momentary lapse of judgment. The bathroom door opened, and Rebecca Matthews entered, her legal training evident in her systematic assessment of their situation. She checked the stalls to ensure privacy before speaking in low, urgent tones. We have maybe 10 minutes before hotel security starts asking questions about why you're hiding in here, she said. Jonathan's out there doing damage control, claiming Victoria needs medical attention for pregnancy-related confusion. His lawyers are probably already on their way. Rebecca's eyes moved to Melody's camera. I assume you got everything. Melody nodded reluctantly. Every detail, perfect lighting, crystal clear images, multiple angles. Then we have a choice to make, Rebecca said. We can file charges based on the assault that 400 people witnessed. But without photographic evidence, it becomes a case of competing narratives. Jonathan's wealth and influence give him significant advantages in that scenario. Victoria's hand moved protectively to her belly as her son kicked restlessly, as if sensing his mother's distress. What's the alternative? We use the photographs, Rebecca said simply. Not for tabloid profit, but as evidence in both criminal proceedings and divorce court. With documentation this clear, Jonathan loses his ability to control the narrative. But Melody was already shaking her head. I can't do that to Victoria. I can't expose her most traumatic moment to public consumption. Turn her pain into media entertainment. I've done enough damage to enough people. This isn't about exploitation, Grace said firmly. This is about protection, about making sure our grandson grows up in a world where his father can't hurt his mother. Victoria closed her eyes, her breathing shallow as she processed the impossible choice. Publishing the photographs would provide irrefutable evidence of Jonathan's abuse, but it would also expose her private trauma to global scrutiny. Not publishing them would protect her privacy, but potentially allow Jonathan to escape consequences and maintain access to their child. There's something else you need to consider, Rebecca added quietly. Jonathan's behavior tonight suggests escalation. Abusers who lose control in public often become more dangerous in private. Your safety and the baby's safety may depend on ensuring he faces immediate consequences that prevent retaliation. The words hung heavy in the artificially scented air of the powder room. Victoria had read enough domestic violence statistics to understand that leaving an abusive partner was often the most dangerous time for victims. Jonathan's public humiliation would make him desperate to regain control. A sharp pain shot through Victoria's lower back, making her gasp and clutch her belly. The stress, the violence, the emotional trauma of the evening were taking their toll on her pregnancy. Victoria, Grace's voice sharpened with concern. What's wrong? Just pressure? Victoria managed, but her face had gone pale and her breathing had become labored. The baby's moving a lot. He's upset. Rebecca was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling an ambulance. This level of stress isn't safe for either of you. But Victoria grabbed her wrist. No, not yet. I need to decide about the photographs first, before Jonathan's lawyers arrive and complicate everything. She looked up at Melody, her eyes filled with tears, but also with a determination that reminded her sister of the ambitious marketing executive Victoria had been before marriage had gradually eroded her confidence. If I ask you to publish those pictures, Victoria said slowly, Can you do it without becoming the person you used to be? Can you use them to help rather than harm? The question struck at the heart of Melody's 3-year journey toward redemption. She'd spent her entire adult life photographing other people's worst moments for profit and entertainment. Now she had the opportunity to use those same skills for justice and protection. "I don't know," Melody admitted, "but I know that watching him hurt you tonight made me understand why some photographs matter more than the photographer's reputation." Victoria nodded, another wave of pain crossing her face. "Then do it. Publish everything. Make sure the world sees exactly what Jonathan Sterling does to women who trust him." The decision made, Rebecca immediately began coordinating next steps. "I'll handle the legal filings. Melody, you'll need to provide testimony about the photograph's authenticity. Victoria, we need to get you medical attention immediately." But as they prepared to leave the bathroom refuge, Victoria grabbed Melody's hand. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Promise me you'll frame this as domestic violence awareness, not celebrity scandal. Help other women recognize what I didn't want to see for so long." Melody squeezed her sister's hand, understanding that Victoria was asking her to transform from paparazzi vulture into advocacy journalist. "I promise, this story will save lives, not destroy them." They opened the bathroom door to find hotel security waiting outside, along with paramedics that someone had called despite Victoria's protests. As medical personnel began assessing Victoria's condition, Melody caught sight of Jonathan across the ballroom, surrounded by lawyers and corporate advisors who were undoubtedly crafting strategies to minimize the damage. But damage control would be impossible once the photographs reached the media. Melody had contacts at every major news outlet, relationships built during her tabloid years that could ensure global distribution within hours. For the first time since leaving Los Angeles, Melody felt the familiar thrill of holding story-changing information. The difference was that this time, she was using her camera to expose an abuser rather than exploit a victim. This time, she was on the right side of the lens. Northwestern Memorial Hospital's emergency department at 11:45 on a Friday night was organized chaos. But Victoria Sterling's arrival cut through the routine like a knife. Word had already spread through Chicago's interconnected social networks that something dramatic had happened at the Sterling Industries anniversary gala, and hospital staff recognized the significance of treating the city's most prominent CEO's pregnant wife for injuries sustained at a public event. Dr. Sarah Bennett, Victoria's obstetrician, arrived 20 minutes after the ambulance, still wearing the cocktail dress she'd worn to her own evening plans. She'd received 3 phone calls on her way to the hospital, each providing different versions of what had transpired at the Riverside Hotel. "Victoria," Dr. Bennett said gently, pulling up a chair beside the examination bed where Victoria lay connected to fetal monitors. "Tell me what happened tonight." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper, but her words were clear. "My husband slapped me in front of 400 people. I think the stress triggered early contractions." The clinical language couldn't disguise the magnitude of what she was admitting. Dr. Bennett had suspected domestic violence for months, noting Victoria's increasing anxiety during appointments, her reluctance to undress for examinations, the carefully explained injuries that followed suspicious patterns. "I need to examine you thoroughly," Dr. Bennett said. "With your permission, I'd like to document any injuries I find, for medical and potentially legal purposes." While Dr. Bennett conducted her examination, Melody sat in the waiting room with Grace and Rebecca, reviewing the photographs on her camera for the 100th time. Each image told the same devastating story, but seeing them repeatedly was beginning to numb Melody to their emotional impact. Rebecca had already contacted her media connections, but she'd insisted on waiting for Victoria's explicit consent before releasing anything. The legal ramifications were complex, involving privacy rights, evidence preservation, and the careful balance between public interest and personal exploitation. "There's something you need to understand about publishing these photographs," Rebecca said quietly, glancing around the waiting room to ensure they weren't overheard. "Once they're public, Victoria loses control of her narrative completely. Every detail of her marriage, every bruise, every moment of private pain becomes public consumption." Grace looked up from her own phone, where she'd been fielding calls from relatives who'd heard rumors about the evening's events. "She's already lost control. Jonathan took that away from her years ago. At least this way, she's making the choice to fight back." Melody's phone buzzed with a text from Caroline Mitchell, the event photographer. Sterling Industries is claiming equipment malfunction. They're saying your camera flash created confusion that led to an accident. They want all photographers to surrender their equipment for investigation. The message confirmed Melody's suspicions about Jonathan's damage control strategy. He would claim technical mishaps, pregnancy-induced confusion, anything to avoid responsibility for public domestic violence. Dr. Bennett emerged from Victoria's room an hour later, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes conveying information she couldn't speak aloud in a public corridor. "Victoria is stable," she announced. "The contractions have subsided, and the baby shows no signs of distress, but I'm recommending overnight observation and mandatory bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'll be documenting all of Victoria's injuries in her medical record. Some appear consistent with recent trauma, while others suggest a pattern of previous incidents." The clinical phrasing was deliberately vague for legal reasons, but everyone understood the implications. Dr. Bennett had found evidence of sustained domestic violence, creating a medical record that would support Victoria's allegations regardless of photographic evidence. "Can I see her?" Melody asked. "Family only, one at a time. She's asked for you specifically." Melody found Victoria in a private room, surrounded by machines monitoring both her vital signs and her son's heartbeat. The steady electronic beeping was oddly comforting, proof that both mother and child were surviving the night's trauma. "How bad is it?" Victoria asked as soon as Melody entered. "The photograph's completely damning. Jonathan's career is over the moment they're published." Victoria nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I keep thinking about what happens next. The media attention, the legal battles, raising a child as a single mother while his father's empire collapses around us." Melody sat in the visitor's chair, setting her camera on the bedside table. "You're not alone in this. Mom and I will help however we can." "I know, but there's something else." Victoria's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Dr. Bennett found evidence of old injuries, broken ribs that healed poorly, evidence of previous head trauma, things I'd almost forgotten about." The admission hung heavy between them. Victoria had minimized Jonathan's abuse for so long that she'd convinced herself the worst incidents were isolated events rather than part of an escalating pattern. "How long?" Melody asked. 3 years. It started small. Comments about my appearance, criticism of my friends, controlling my schedule, then isolation from anyone who might question his behavior. The physical violence began after we got married." Victoria's hand moved to her belly, where her son continued his restless movement. "I told myself it would stop when I got pregnant, that he'd change when he became a father. Instead, he got worse, more possessive, more paranoid about protecting his legacy." The heart monitor showed increased maternal stress, and Melody realized that discussing the abuse was affecting Victoria's physical condition. But Victoria seemed desperate to finally voice truths she'd hidden for years. "He had investigators following me for weeks," Victoria continued. "He knew about my meetings with Rebecca, my plans to leave. Tonight was supposed to be his demonstration of control, showing me that I could never escape his influence. Instead, Jonathan's need to control had backfired spectacularly, leading to public exposure of his abusive behavior." A soft knock interrupted them, and Grace entered with obvious relief at seeing her daughter conscious and coherent. But her expression darkened when she noticed fresh bruising on Victoria's neck that hadn't been visible in the ballroom's dramatic lighting. "Sweetheart," Grace said gently, "those marks on your throat." Victoria's hand moved instinctively to cover fingerprint bruises that were just beginning to darken. "From last week, he choked me when I questioned his decision to fire Maria, our housekeeper. She'd been asking too many questions about my injuries." The casual way Victoria described nearly being strangled revealed how normalized such violence had become in her marriage. Grace's face went white as she processed that her daughter had been living in mortal danger for months. "That's it," Grace said firmly. "We're publishing those photographs tonight. Every news outlet, every social media platform, everything. I will not allow that man one more opportunity to hurt you or my grandson." Before Victoria could respond, her room's television automatically switched to breaking news coverage. A local reporter stood outside the Riverside Hotel, where police cars and media vans had transformed the elegant entrance into a crime scene. Sources confirm that Sterling Industries CEO Jonathan Sterling was involved in a domestic violence incident at tonight's anniversary celebration, the reporter announced. Chicago police have not yet filed charges, but witnesses report that Sterling physically struck his pregnant wife in front of hundreds of guests. The story was already public, spreading through social media faster than traditional news outlets could verify details. Melody realized that Caroline Mitchell and other photographers had probably released their own images. Blurry smartphone footage that told the story but lacked the devastating clarity of professional documentation. Victoria watched the coverage with surprising calm. "It's out there now. No going back." She turned to Melody, her voice gaining strength despite her physical exhaustion. "Publish your photographs, all of them. Let people see exactly what domestic violence looks like when it happens to women who seem to have everything." Melody nodded, understanding that her sister had just given her permission to end Jonathan Sterling's carefully constructed empire and potentially save other women from similar abuse. As she prepared to transform from photographer to whistleblower, Melody realized this story would define the rest of her career, not as exploitation, but as advocacy, not as entertainment, but as education. For the first time in 3 years, she was proud of what her camera had captured. Saturday morning arrived with Chicago's skyline bathed in golden autumn light and Melody Hartwell's photographs dominating every major news platform in North America. By 6 a.m., the images had been viewed over 10 million times across social media platforms, turning Jonathan Sterling's private abuse into a global case study in domestic violence among the wealthy and powerful. Melody sat in Northwestern Memorial Hospital's family consultation room, her laptop open to a dozen news websites that featured her documentation of the previous evening's events. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and every Chicago media outlet had picked up the story. But it was the international coverage that truly demonstrated the photograph's impact. BBC News led with the headline, "American CEO Strikes Pregnant Wife at Corporate Gala." Australia's major networks were calling it the Sterling Scandal. European papers were analyzing American corporate culture and domestic violence statistics. But Melody hadn't published the photographs for global attention. She'd worked exclusively with Rebecca Matthews to ensure the images were released through proper legal channels, with accompanying statements about domestic violence awareness and Victoria's courage in speaking publicly about her experience. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," Rebecca said, entering the consultation room with coffee and a legal pad covered in notes. Interview requests from 63 media outlets, including 3 documentary filmmakers and someone from Netflix. Sterling Industries stock dropped 37% in overseas trading. Victoria, who'd spent the night in the hospital for observation, looked exhausted but determined as she reviewed the coverage on Rebecca's tablet. Dr. Bennett had cleared her for discharge, but recommended continued bed rest and stress management for the remainder of her pregnancy. "What about criminal charges?" Victoria asked. "The Cook County State's attorney is reviewing evidence for potential assault charges," Rebecca replied. "With this level of media attention and photographic documentation, they'll likely move forward regardless of your cooperation, but your testimony would strengthen the case significantly." The consultation room door opened, and Grace entered with news that made everyone's morning even more complicated. "Jonathan's downstairs," she announced grimly. "He's demanding to see Victoria, claiming spousal rights and medical decision-making authority. Hospital security is trying to manage the situation, but there are also reporters in the lobby now." Victoria's heart rate immediately spiked, visible on the portable monitor Dr. Bennett had insisted she continue wearing. Even the mention of Jonathan's proximity triggered physiological stress responses that demonstrated the genuine nature of her trauma. "He can't force me to see him, can he?" Victoria asked Rebecca. "Absolutely not. I've already filed for a temporary restraining order based on the documented abuse, but until that's processed, hospital security is your primary protection." Melody's phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she recognized from her Los Angeles days. Marcus Chen, a producer at Entertainment Tonight who'd bought dozens of her celebrity scandal stories during her paparazzi career. She declined the call, but the contact reminded her of the fundamental difference between her current situation and her previous work. 3 years ago, she would have sold these photographs to the highest bidder without considering the human cost. Now, she'd release them strategically to protect her sister and educate the public about domestic violence. But that distinction might not matter to critics who would inevitably question her motives. "There's something else," Rebecca said, consulting her notes. "Sterling Industries' board of directors called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Sources suggest they're discussing Jonathan's removal as CEO. The speed of corporate consequences was unprecedented. But then again, Melody had documented unprecedented corporate behavior. Public domestic violence by a Fortune 500 CEO was uncharted territory for crisis management professionals." Victoria's phone, which Rebecca had secured from Jonathan's monitoring software, showed 47 missed calls and 183 text messages. Most were from reporters, but several were from friends and colleagues expressing support or concern. One message stood out from Dr. Patricia Williams, the family court judge who would likely oversee Victoria's divorce proceedings. "Proud of your courage, available to discuss protective measures whenever you're ready." But it was the message from Maria Santos, their former housekeeper, that brought tears to Victoria's eyes. "I should have called police when I saw bruises. So sorry I failed you. Ready to testify about what I witnessed." The support network Victoria thought she'd lost through Jonathan's isolation tactics was reassembling around her public display of courage. "I want to give one interview," Victoria announced suddenly. "Someone reputable, national reach, focused on domestic violence awareness rather than celebrity scandal." Rebecca nodded approvingly. "Anderson Cooper's team already reached out through proper channels. He's covered domestic violence extensively and would handle this with appropriate sensitivity." As they planned Victoria's media strategy, Melody's laptop chimed with a Google alert for her own name. The first wave of articles analyzing her role in the story was beginning to appear, and the coverage was predictably mixed. Some outlets praised her transformation from paparazzi exploiter to domestic violence advocate. Others questioned her motives, suggesting she'd orchestrated the entire scandal for professional redemption. A few resurrected her Los Angeles controversy, analyzing whether her past disqualified her from claiming moral authority. But the most important coverage came from domestic violence organizations that were already using her photographs in educational materials. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence had released a statement praising the documentation of abuse among wealthy victims, noting that economic privilege didn't prevent intimate partner violence. "This is bigger than just our family situation," Victoria observed, scrolling through social media responses to the photographs. "Women are sharing their own stories, talking about abuse they've hidden because their abusers seem too successful or charming to be believed." Melody realized that her sister was right. The photographs had sparked a national conversation about domestic violence in contexts that challenged stereotypical assumptions. Victoria Sterling looked like she had everything: wealth, education, social status, a powerful husband, a beautiful life. If someone like her could be trapped in an abusive relationship, then anyone could be vulnerable. The hospital room's television switched to live coverage from outside Sterling Industries headquarters, where protesters had gathered with signs reading, "Justice for Victoria" and "Believe survivors." Counter-protesters carried signs defending Jonathan's reputation and questioning the timing of Victoria's allegations. But the most significant development was the line of Sterling Industries employees walking out of the building, many carrying resignation letters and statements to reporters about working conditions they'd previously accepted as normal. Jonathan's abuse hadn't been limited to his wife. Melody's photographs had exposed a pattern of behavior that extended throughout his professional relationships, emboldening other victims to speak publicly for the first time. By noon, 3 more women had come forward with allegations of sexual harassment and workplace intimidation by Jonathan Sterling. The photographs that documented one moment of domestic violence had revealed systematic abuse of power across multiple contexts. As Victoria prepared to leave the hospital under security escort, she turned to Melody with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with exhaustion. "I know this cost you something," Victoria said. "Using your camera this way, dealing with media attention you tried to avoid. Thank you for choosing my safety over your privacy." Melody hugged her sister carefully, mindful of her pregnant belly and residual soreness from the previous evening's trauma. "I've spent 3 years trying to figure out how to use my skills for good instead of harm," Melody replied. "You gave me the chance to find out." As they left Northwestern Memorial Hospital, protected by security personnel and flanked by supporters, Melody realized that she'd finally answered the question that had haunted her since leaving Los Angeles. She could be the photographer she wanted to be, but it had taken her sister's courage to show her how. The Cook County Criminal Courthouse at 26th in California had seen its share of high-profile cases. But the prosecution of Jonathan Sterling attracted media attention unlike anything in recent Chicago legal history. 4 weeks after the Sterling Industries anniversary gala, Victoria Sterling sat in the witness box, 7 weeks from giving birth, providing testimony that would determine whether her husband faced criminal consequences for domestic violence. Melody positioned herself in the gallery's front row, her camera bag deliberately absent. She'd testified the previous day about the photograph's authenticity, enduring 3 hours of cross-examination designed to discredit her credibility and motives. Jonathan's defense team had predictably focused on her paparazzi past, suggesting she'd orchestrated the entire scandal for professional gain. But the prosecution had been prepared for that strategy. They'd presented overwhelming corroborating evidence, medical records documenting Victoria's injuries, testimony from Maria Santos about bruises she'd witnessed, financial records showing Jonathan's control over Victoria's access to money, phone records revealing monitoring software on Victoria's devices. Most damaging of all had been testimony from other Sterling Industries employees who described a pattern of intimidation, verbal abuse, and sexual harassment that painted Jonathan as a man who used his power to control and hurt others systematically. Victoria's voice remained steady as she described 3 years of escalating abuse, but Melody could see the physical toll that public testimony was taking on her sister. Dr. Bennett sat in the gallery, monitoring Victoria's condition and prepared to request medical recess if necessary. Mrs. Sterling, Assistant State's Attorney Jennifer Walsh said gently, "Can you describe the events that led to your husband striking you at the anniversary celebration?" Victoria's hand moved protectively to her belly, where her son had been restless throughout the morning's proceedings. "I had decided to announce my independence. Not dramatically, just a simple statement that success requires partnership based on equality. When Jonathan realized I was deviating from his script, he tried to physically control me. Had he used physical control previously? Many times, but always in private, where no one could witness it or photograph it." Jonathan's defense attorney, Margaret Rothstein, had built her career defending Chicago's elite from criminal consequences. She rose for cross-examination with the confidence of someone accustomed to destroying victims' credibility through systematic character assassination. "Mrs. Sterling," Rothstein began, "you've admitted to planning this confrontation for weeks. You met secretly with a divorce attorney, established secret financial accounts, and invited your sister, a photographer with a history of staging scandals for profit, to document the evening. Doesn't this sound like an elaborate setup?" Victoria met the attorney's challenging stare without flinching. "Yes, I plan to protect myself and my child. I plan to establish evidence of abuse that my husband had hidden for years. If that sounds elaborate, consider how elaborate his system of control had become. But you never called police during these alleged 3 years of abuse? My husband controlled our phones. Our home security system recorded everything. His employees monitored my communications. He had private investigators following me. When would I have safely contacted police?" Rothstein's strategy backfired as Victoria's answers revealed the sophisticated nature of Jonathan's control rather than discrediting her allegations. The jury was seeing domestic violence as it actually functioned among wealthy, powerful abusers who had resources to maintain privacy and control narratives. "Mrs. Sterling, your sister has a documented history of exploiting people's private pain for tabloid profit. How do we know she didn't encourage this confrontation to create photographable drama?" Victoria's response was immediate and fierce. "Because my sister quit that career specifically because she understood how much harm those photographs could cause. She tried to talk me out of using her pictures. She only agreed when I convinced her that other women needed to see what domestic violence looks like when the abuser wears expensive suits and donates to children's charities." The testimony continued for 2 more hours, with Rothstein attempting various strategies to undermine Victoria's credibility. But Jonathan's defense was fundamentally flawed because it required the jury to believe that a woman 8 months pregnant had orchestrated her own public humiliation and assault for unclear financial gain. During a brief recess, Melody overheard 2 jurors discussing the case in the hallway. "I keep thinking about my own marriage," one woman said quietly. The way he controls her money, monitors her phone, isolates her from friends. My husband does some of those things, but I never thought of it as abuse. That's the point, her fellow juror replied. We think abuse looks like black eyes and broken bones, but this is about power and control. The violence is just the enforcement mechanism. The conversation confirmed what Melody had hoped her photographs would accomplish. They weren't just documenting one woman's trauma. They were educating people about domestic violence patterns that often went unrecognized until they escalated to physical violence. When court resumed, the prosecution called its final witness, Thomas Sterling, Jonathan's 75-year-old father and founder of Sterling Industries. The elderly man walked slowly to the witness box, his appearance frail but his voice strong as he was sworn in. Thomas Sterling had built his company through 4 decades of ethical business practices, and his son's behavior had shattered both his personal pride and professional legacy. Mr. Sterling, Prosecutor Walsh said, you've worked closely with your son for 20 years. Were you aware of his treatment of his wife? Thomas Sterling's answer surprised everyone in the courtroom. I suspected something was wrong. Victoria changed over the years, became quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped attending family dinners, made excuses to avoid social events. But Jonathan was so charming, so successful, that I convinced myself I was imagining problems. What changed your mind? Seeing those photographs, watching my son strike a pregnant woman in public, seeing the rage on his face, realizing that what happened in that ballroom was probably happening regularly in private. Thomas Sterling's voice broke slightly. I failed my daughter-in-law by not investigating my suspicions. I failed the company by allowing someone with those character flaws to represent our values. The testimony from Jonathan's own father was devastating to the defense's narrative. It established that even family members who loved Jonathan had recognized concerning patterns in his behavior. As the elderly man stepped down from the witness box, he stopped beside Victoria's seat and whispered something that made tears stream down her face. Later, Victoria would tell Melody that Thomas had apologized and promised financial support for her and her grandson, regardless of legal proceedings' outcomes. The trial's final drama came as closing arguments were being prepared. Victoria, exhausted by hours of testimony and emotional stress, suddenly doubled over with unmistakable contractions. Your Honor, Dr. Bennett called from the gallery, Mrs. Sterling needs immediate medical attention. She's going into premature labor. The courtroom erupted as paramedics were called, and Victoria was transported by ambulance to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The jury was dismissed while everyone waited to learn whether stress from the trial had triggered dangerous early labor. 6 hours later, David Sterling was born at 35 weeks gestation, small but healthy, in the same hospital where his mother had been treated for injuries from domestic violence 5 weeks earlier. Jonathan, who'd been released on bail during the trial, was barred from the hospital by restraining order. His son entered the world without him, surrounded by women who'd fought to protect both mother and child from his influence. 2 days later, the jury returned guilty verdicts on charges of domestic violence and assault. Jonathan Sterling was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay substantial restitution for medical expenses and psychological counseling. But the real victory wasn't the criminal conviction. It was David Sterling sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, safe from a father who confused control with love, fear with respect. Melody photographed that first mother-son portrait with tears in her eyes, understanding that sometimes the most important pictures were the ones that showed healing instead of harm. 6 months after David Sterling entered the world 5 weeks early in a rush of courtroom drama and media attention, spring sunshine streamed through the windows of Victoria's new apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. The modest 2-bedroom space couldn't have been more different from the Gold Coast mansion she'd shared with Jonathan, but every detail reflected choices she'd made freely. Melody adjusted her camera settings while Victoria nursed 6-month-old David on the living room couch. Preparing for a photo shoot that would complete the most important story of her career, People magazine had commissioned a follow-up piece on Victoria's journey from domestic violence victim to independent single mother, and Melody was documenting every moment of her sister's transformation. He's gotten so much bigger, Melody observed, capturing the peaceful intimacy between mother and child. David had thrived after his dramatic early arrival, growing into a healthy, alert baby who seemed to sense the safety and love surrounding his new life. Victoria smiled. the expression genuine and unguarded in ways that Melody hadn't seen during the years of her sister's marriage. Dr. Bennett says he's perfectly on track developmentally. No lasting effects from the early delivery or the stress during pregnancy. The apartment reflected Victoria's gradual reclamation of her identity. Family photos that Jonathan had forbidden were displayed prominently. Books she'd been discouraged from reading filled handmade shelves. The color scheme was warm and welcoming, rather than the sterile perfection Jonathan had demanded in their mansion. Most importantly, Victoria had returned to work part-time as a marketing consultant, rebuilding the career that marriage had slowly eroded. Her first client was a domestic violence nonprofit that used her story and Melody's photographs in awareness campaigns. The Wisconsin speaking engagement went well, Melody asked, continuing to photograph while they talked. Better than expected. 300 people, mostly women who recognized something in my story that reflected their own experiences. 2 approached me afterward to say they were leaving abusive relationships after hearing my speech. That was the real measure of success for both sisters. The photographs that had documented Victoria's abuse were now being used educationally, helping other women recognize warning signs and understand that domestic violence affected people at every economic level. Rebecca Matthews arrived for the interview portion of the magazine feature. Her legal training still essential as Victoria navigated the complex aftermath of her public divorce and Jonathan's criminal conviction. The final divorce decree is official, Rebecca announced, settling into Victoria's chosen armchair, with the satisfaction of someone who'd fought hard for justice. Full custody, substantial child support, and a restraining order that remains in effect until David turns 18. Jonathan had served 6 months of his 18-month sentence before being released to house arrest and community service. Sterling Industries had severed all ties with him, with Thomas Sterling assuming temporary leadership while the board searched for a new CEO. The company's reputation had recovered surprisingly quickly once Jonathan's abusive behavior was clearly separated from the organization's values. Any contact attempts? Rebecca asked, reviewing her legal files. None directly, Victoria replied. But his mother called last week, wanting to establish visitation rights with David. Melody lowered her camera, immediately concerned. Jonathan's family had remained supportive of him throughout the trial, suggesting that Victoria had somehow provoked his behavior or exaggerated its severity. What did you tell her? That David's safety comes first. If Jonathan completes anger management and demonstrates genuine change, supervised visitation might be possible eventually, but he doesn't get access to his son just because he's genetically related. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the apartment door. Victoria checked the security monitor that she'd installed as part of reclaiming control over her environment, then smiled and buzzed the visitor upstairs. Dr. Sarah Bennett entered carrying flowers and a small gift bag, her monthly wellness check having evolved into genuine friendship during Victoria's recovery. How's my favorite patient? Dr. Bennett asked, automatically assessing both Victoria's physical condition and David's developmental progress with the practiced eye of someone who'd guided them both through trauma and healing. Stronger every day, Victoria replied, and Melody could hear the truth in her sister's voice. The constant vigilance of abuse survival was gradually being replaced by genuine confidence and peace. Dr. Bennett's visit reminded Melody of how many people had rallied around Victoria once her abuse became public. The isolation Jonathan had enforced had dissolved immediately, revealing a support network that had been waiting for permission to help. I have news, Dr. Bennett announced, settling cross-legged on the floor where David was playing with colorful blocks. The medical center is establishing a new domestic violence screening protocol based on lessons learned from your case. We're training all staff to recognize signs of abuse among patients who seem to have everything. That was perhaps the most important outcome of Victoria's public testimony. Medical professionals, social workers, and law enforcement were receiving education about domestic violence patterns among wealthy victims, understanding that economic privilege didn't prevent intimate partner abuse. Melody's phone buzzed with a notification that made her smile. The Pulitzer Prize Committee had nominated her domestic violence photojournalism series for a prestigious award, recognizing her transformation from exploitative paparazzi to advocacy journalist. But more meaningful than professional recognition was the email she'd received that morning from a woman in Seattle whose life had been saved by recognizing abuse patterns from Melody's photographs and Victoria's story. "I wanted to show you something," Victoria said, retrieving a leather portfolio from her bedroom. "The nonprofit asked me to review materials for their next awareness campaign." Sure. The portfolio contained dozens of photographs from Melody's series, but arranged to tell a story of survival and transformation rather than focusing solely on violence and trauma. Images of Victoria's physical healing were paired with pictures of her emotional recovery, David's healthy development, and the community support that had emerged from her courage. "They want to use these in high schools," Victoria explained, "teaching teenagers about healthy relationship patterns and warning signs of abuse before they become trapped in dangerous situations." Melody studied the portfolio, seeing her work arranged to educate rather than sensationalize. The transformation felt complete. She'd spent 3 years learning to use her camera for healing instead of harm, and Victoria's courage had provided the opportunity to prove that redemption was possible. "There's something else," Victoria said, her voice taking on the nervous excitement Melody remembered from their childhood when Victoria had important news to share. "I've been offered a position with the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, full-time, based here in Chicago, developing programs for survivors who come from privileged backgrounds." The job offer represented everything Victoria had lost during her marriage to Jonathan and was now reclaiming professional purpose, financial independence, the ability to help others through her own experience of trauma and survival. "The salary isn't huge," Victoria continued, "but it's enough to support David and me comfortably. More importantly, it's work that matters. Work that uses what happened to us to prevent it from happening to other families." Rebecca smiled with professional satisfaction. The job offer came through legitimate channels, not sympathy connections. They want Victoria because she's uniquely qualified to understand and address domestic violence in contexts that often go unrecognized. As the afternoon progressed, Melody continued photographing, while Victoria shared stories about her new life. The weekly therapy sessions that were helping her process years of psychological abuse. The parenting classes where she was learning to raise David without the fear and hypervigilance that had defined her pregnancy. The friendship with other domestic violence survivors who understood her journey in ways that well-meaning but inexperienced supporters couldn't. David began fussing as his nap time approached, and Victoria lifted him with the natural confidence of a mother who no longer feared that every parenting decision would be criticized or overruled. She'd worried during pregnancy about her ability to protect and nurture her child after years of being told she was inadequate at everything she attempted. But watching Victoria with David over the past 6 months, Melody had seen her sister rediscover maternal instincts that abuse had suppressed but never destroyed. "He looks like Dad," Victoria said softly, studying David's features as he settled into sleepy contentment. "Our dad, not Jonathan. The same gentle eyes, the same stubborn chin." Their father had died when Victoria was 25 and Melody was 22, but his influence on both daughters remained strong. He taught them that real strength came from protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, that using power to help rather than harm was the measure of true character. "Dad would be proud of what you've accomplished," Melody said, capturing a tender moment between mother and child, "and proud of how you're using your experience to help other women." As David drifted off to sleep in Victoria's arms, the apartment filled with the peaceful quiet of a home where safety was assumed rather than fought for. The contrast with the tension that had defined Victoria's marriage was stark and healing. "I never thought I'd feel this calm," Victoria admitted, gently transferring David to his crib in the bedroom, decorated with cheerful animals instead of the austere perfection Jonathan would have demanded. "For 3 years, I was constantly afraid of saying the wrong thing, wearing the wrong outfit, making any choice that might trigger his anger. And now I make decisions based on what's best for David and me, not what will avoid someone else's violent reaction. It's amazing how much easier life becomes when you're not walking on eggshells every moment." The People magazine interview concluded with Victoria sharing advice for other women who might recognize themselves in her story. Her message was simple but powerful: abuse among wealthy, successful families was just as real and dangerous as abuse in any other context. And economic privilege could actually make escape more difficult by providing abusers with additional tools of control. "Don't let anyone tell you it can't be abuse because he's successful, because you live in a nice house, because he's charming in public," Victoria said directly to the camera. "Abuse is about power and control, not economic status, And if you're reading this story and recognizing your own situation, please know that help is available and escape is possible. As the interview team packed their equipment, Rebecca lingered to discuss legal developments that wouldn't be included in the magazine article, but were important for Victoria's ongoing security. Jonathan's parole review is coming up, Rebecca said quietly. He's completed the mandatory anger management program and is requesting modification of the restraining order to allow supervised visitation with David. Victoria's expression tightened slightly, but she didn't show the panic that such news would have triggered 6 months earlier. What do you recommend? Proceed very cautiously. Abusers often use children as weapons to maintain control over their victims. But legally, he has parental rights unless we can demonstrate continued danger to David's welfare. The reminder that Jonathan remained a threat despite his conviction was sobering, but Victoria had developed coping strategies and support systems that made his continued presence in their lives manageable rather than terrifying. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Victoria said firmly. "Right now, David and I are building a life based on love and safety. Jonathan doesn't get to disrupt that just because he completed a court-ordered program." As evening approached, Melody prepared to leave her sister's apartment, but not before capturing one final photograph for her personal collection rather than the magazine feature. Victoria stood at her living room window, holding David while they watched the sunset paint Chicago's skyline in brilliant oranges and pinks. The image showed a young mother and her child safe in their own home, surrounded by evidence of choices made freely rather than decisions imposed by fear. It was the photograph Melody was most proud of in her entire career, because it documented healing instead of harm, hope instead of despair. "Thank you," Victoria said as Melody packed her camera equipment. "For everything. For risking your reputation to help me. For using your skills to protect David. For showing me that it's possible to turn pain into purpose." Melody hugged her sister and nephew, understanding that their journey together had transformed them both. Victoria had reclaimed her strength and independence. Melody had discovered how to use her talents for justice rather than exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, David Sterling would grow up in a home where love was unconditional and violence was unacceptable, breaking a cycle that might otherwise have continued for another generation. 6 months after the Sterling Industries anniversary gala had ended in documented domestic violence, Victoria Sterling was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, an advocate, and a mother raising her son with the courage her own father had taught her years before. As Melody drove home through Chicago's evening traffic, she reflected on the photographer she'd become versus the photographer she'd been. 3 years ago, she would have sold Victoria's pain to the highest bidder without considering the human cost. Now, she'd used her camera to save her sister's life and educate thousands of people about domestic violence patterns they might otherwise have missed. The transformation hadn't been easy, and it wasn't complete. Melody still received offers to photograph celebrity scandals for enormous sums of money. She still felt tempted by the adrenaline rush of capturing secrets that could destroy reputations and generate headlines. But every time temptation arose, she remembered Victoria's bruised face in the hospital, David's premature birth triggered by courtroom stress, and the dozens of women who'd contacted her to say that her photographs had helped them recognize and escape their own abusive relationships. Some photographs were worth more than money, some stories mattered more than fame, and some redemption was worth whatever it cost. Melody's phone buzzed with a text message from Caroline Mitchell. Her former event photography colleague saw the People magazine feature online. "Beautiful work. You found your true calling." The message was simple, but it carried deep meaning. Melody had indeed found her calling, not as a predatory paparazzi or a scandal photographer, but as someone who used visual storytelling to protect the vulnerable and educate the privileged. As she pulled into her own apartment building's parking garage, Melody realized that the story that had begun with a camera flash at an anniversary party had become something much larger than one family's trauma. It had become a catalyst for conversations about domestic violence, corporate accountability, and the responsibility that came with privilege and power. Victoria Sterling had transformed from victim to survivor to advocate, using her experience to help other women escape similar situations. David Sterling had entered the world surrounded by people committed to breaking cycles of abuse and building healthier relationships. And Melody Hartwell had learned that redemption was possible for anyone willing to use their skills in service of justice rather than exploitation. The anniversary party that had begun as a celebration of corporate success had ended as documentation of criminal behavior. But from that documentation had grown education, awareness, and hope for thousands of people who needed to understand that domestic violence could happen to anyone, anywhere, regardless of wealth or social status. 6 months later, as spring turned toward summer and David Sterling grew stronger every day in his mother's loving arms, the most important photograph in Melody's entire career remained the one she'd never published: Victoria and David silhouetted against the Chicago sunset, free and safe and building a future based on love instead of fear. That image would never appear in magazines or news articles. It existed only for them, a private document of survival and transformation that proved healing was possible even after the worst betrayal. Sometimes the most powerful photographs were the ones that showed not what had been lost, but what could be rebuilt from the ruins of broken trust. Victoria Sterling had learned that lesson through courage and pain. Melody Hartwell had learned it through witnessing her sister's journey from victim to victor. And David Sterling would grow up understanding it as simply the way love was supposed to work: protective, nurturing, and completely free from fear. The camera flash that had illuminated Jonathan Sterling's violence at the anniversary party had also illuminated the beginning of their freedom. 6 months later, that freedom had become a foundation for building something better than what had been destroyed. In the end, that was the story Melody was proudest to have documented: not the destruction of a marriage built on abuse, but the construction of a life built on authentic love and genuine safety. The photographs would continue educating people about domestic violence for years to come, but the real victory was simpler and more profound. Victoria Sterling and her son were safe, free, and building a future where violence had no place and love required no fear. That was the happy ending both sisters had fought to create, one photograph and one day at a time. Victoria Sterling's courage to speak out has already helped countless women recognize the warning signs in their own relationships. Melody's transformation from exploitative paparazzi to advocate journalist proves that redemption is possible when we use our skills to protect rather than harm. If this story opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, help us reach other women who might need to hear Victoria's message. Hit that like button to show your support for survivors everywhere. Share this with someone who needs to understand that domestic violence doesn't discriminate based on wealth or status, and subscribe with notifications on, because stories like these, stories that educate rather than just entertain, are exactly what we're committed to bringing you. Your engagement isn't just about numbers. It's about ensuring that Victoria's voice reaches the women who need to hear that escape is possible, that help is available, and that no one deserves to live in fear. Together, we can turn one family's trauma into education that saves lives. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for helping spread awareness that could literally be the difference between life and death for someone in your community.